This is a lecture from Open Tuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.
Corporate governance refers to the system by which companies are directed and controlled. And good corporate governance is immensely important in reducing the risk relating to organizations of all sorts. Historically, corporate governance was not taken very seriously, maybe until about 20 years ago. What you tended to have was the annual general meeting once a year. It was at the annual general meeting that all the shareholders, the real owners of the company, could come. The directors would be there. They would present their financial statements, which were audited. The auditing adds a bit of credibility to those. But really then, for the rest of the year, the directors could be getting up to all sorts of potentially mischief. They should have been looking after the company on behalf of the shareholders, but powerful directors could have been awarding themselves very generous pay packages, could have been causing the company to embark on very risky sort of activities. And it could be a year or even 15 months before the next AGM and the next set of financial statements were presented. And a lot of things had happened between these sort of annual gaps. Directors' board meetings might not have been very frequent. They sometimes, and it was in the board meeting where the directors as a body collectively should be looking really at the strategic position of the company. They should be looking, where is this company going to be in 5 or 10 years? Would it be surviving? What sort of decisions could we make? They should be very interested in the strategic risk as well as keeping an eye on operational risks and so on. And quite often what happened was that you'd have lots of directors kind of side conversations. What the CEO could do was to go to one director and kind of talk to that one director, get that one director on your side, go to another director, get them on your side, etc., etc. And by the time it came to the AGM, everyone had been kind of got at almost. And when the CEO put forward a particular proposal, which kind of said yes, without really proper discussion having been taken place. What was then discovered, really, in the early 2000s, really, a number of financial scandals. Enron and WorldCom were very large ones. More recently, in the financial crisis of 2008, Lehman Brothers went into liquidation and so on. And you had these very, really huge companies, huge international companies, quoted on stock exchange and so on, audited by what you might call respectable auditors, and suddenly going into liquidation. And people said, well, this really shouldn't happen. What's gone wrong? And the whole approach really to corporate governance was examined again to try to prevent these scandals and people losing a lot of money, people maybe losing their pension entitlements and so on, a lot of damage being done. The purpose of external audit, and this is a kind of a diagram which can show this old-fashioned way, really, of corporate governance. You have the shareholders, and strictly speaking, they're the ones who own the company. The directors should be managing the company on behalf of the shareholders. But of course, in a large company, the shareholders aren't going to be doing the management. We're not talking about small companies here. The shareholders should appoint the directors. And then once a year, the directors prepare the financial statements. The auditors add credibility to it. The financial statements are shown to the shareholders who can see what's happened historically. And then there's this relationship between the external auditors and the shareholders. The auditors should be reporting to the shareholders on whether or not the financial statements are showing a true and fair view. Okay, it was better than nothing. It showed you how the company had done over the previous financial period. but then you wait another year, another 15 months perhaps, before you get any more news. Not good enough. The theories of corporate governance are these. First of all, there is stewardship theory. This is the idea that management or directors must look after and care for the company assets here, really to conserve those, to do the best they can with them. They should look after them. They are stewards on behalf of the shareholders. It's potentially undermined if the owners don't take an active risk in the organisation. And many shareholders were almost their own worst enemies. They would just let the directors get on kind of with whatever they were doing without taking much of an interest there. We know that looking after the company assets, one of the things that the directors need to be doing is this balance of the risk and the return, the conformance and the performance there. And if you're going to be looking after company assets properly, you should be thinking about the risk appetite of your shareholders. The second theory is the agency theory, where management are the agents of the shareholders. Shareholders appoint management. Management should be looking after the best interests of the shareholders when they are managing the company. The temptation here is that agents are not looking after the best interest of the shareholders. They're principals. They're looking after their own best interests, huge pay deals, very generous perks and benefits, which is helping the directors but not necessarily helping the shareholders. And finally, just to complete it, there's something called stakeholder theory, a relatively new idea which is suggesting that maybe there's a duty of care not just to look after the assets on behalf of the shareholders, but there are a number of different stakeholders. For example, employees. Previous employees who are now pensioners and rely on the pension funds that the company has set up and so on. That maybe we own a duty of care also to the people living close to the factory, the kind of environmental considerations as well. This maybe hasn't gone very far because it's very difficult to perhaps know or to put down legislation about how much you should look after other stakeholders. How do you come to balance the rights of the shareholder to the rights of the employee, to the rights of the customer, to the rights of the people living close to the factory and so on. But it's certainly there in theory. Now, the OECD, this is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, they came out with certain high-level principles, and then it was up to different countries to implement these principles in a different way. And there's a very different approach, for example, between the way corporate governance high-level principles were adopted really by America. They had a very have a very statute-based approach, which is based on something called the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, to the UK, where there's really nothing in statute dealing with corporate governance at all. So the OECD put out these principles of corporate governance and let countries get on with it, really. And what we want, the first thing they said here, is this idea of a transparent and efficient market. Now, a transparent and efficient market, a market is efficient if the share price is an accurate reflection of the true value of the share. So, for example, any hiding of good news, hiding of bad news, hiding maybe that there's a takeover in the offing and so on there, means that what's going on with your company isn't transparent. If you don't know there's been some problem with a major product, the share price will stay high, it'll be overvalued maybe, when maybe if this product has to be withdrawn, your profits are going to drop, the share price should be much lower. So we have to have a proper disclosure, really. The rights of shareholders and key ownership functions should be respected, really, here. Shareholders should be informed, shareholders should have votes on important resolutions and so on here. It's important that we recognise that the shareholders are the owners of the company, and they must certainly be kept informed. They must certainly be able to make important decisions. We need equitable treatment of shareholders, including minority and foreign shareholders. Foreign shareholders, if you have a company which is listed on the UK stock exchange, of course a lot of news goes around within the City of London. If you're a shareholder based, let's say, in Sydney, Australia, you're going to be out of the loop slightly. You'll be maybe a little bit slow hearing important news, and that's not fair. Minority shareholders, if I own 100 shares in a company, the finance director is never going to take me out to lunch. But if you had a pension fund trustee and the pension funds owns 10% of the company, then this very large, influential shareholder may well be taken out to lunch by the finance director and may be given information that I, as a small shareholder, am not. And that would be unfair to maybe what the vast majority of shareholders are, probably small shareholders. Recognise the rights of shareholders as established by law. Make sure there's timely and accurate information on all material matters. And set out some responsibilities of the board. What is responsibility of the board? What should they be looking at in the board meetings and so on? How should they be making decisions? Now, in the UK, corporate governance is implemented through the UK Corporate Governance Code. The purpose of the code is to facilitate effective entrepreneurial and prudent management. Now, here we have this kind of conflict in again. Entrepreneurial management implies taking some risks. All entrepreneurs take risks. Should I open in this country? Should I develop that product? And there's prudent management, which is kind of drawing back on this entrepreneurship to deliver long-term success. So we're interested in getting this balance between conformance and performance. The UK Corporate Governance Code is not in statute. It is really only enforceable against listed companies. So if you're going to be listed on the UK Stock Exchange, you have to comply with the UK Corporate Governance Code. Otherwise, the stock exchange has got certain sanctions against you, and in extreme situations, the stock exchange could suspend the quote. In other words, not allow the shares to be traded anymore on the stock exchange because they were unhappy with the corporate governance. Maybe they were unhappy with the disclosure of information so that the price as shown on the stock exchange didn't properly reflect the true worth of the company. If you don't do that, if a company doesn't comply with the corporate governance code, it has to explain why not. And of course the explanation may or may not be accepted by shareholders and by the stock exchange. They come out with these 5 headings. I think you need to know those. Leadership, proper effectiveness really of the board. The board should be accountable. We have to look at the remuneration of the board, and we have to look at the relations with shareholders to make sure that we try to bring in shareholders to the discussion. We involve them fully in important decisions. We want active shareholders, not just passive ones. Leadership. What does our UK governance code say about that? It says every company should be headed by an effective board, collectively responsible for the long-term success. Now, there's a lot going on in here. Collectively responsible. In other words, they should meet as a board and take a proper vote, not this carving off of individual board members and kind of getting on your side. And it's long-term success of the company. It's very much concerned with the strategic future of the company, the long-term success of the company. To some extent, any fool can make a success of a company for a year, but that's not good enough. We want long-term success and growth and so on, and an element of safety. We're not talking about getting rid of all risk, but at least we need to understand what the risks are. And here we have then the first big requirement here, non-executive directors and also the split of CEO and chairman. There should be a clear division between the running of the board and the executive responsible for running the company. So the CEO is a person who is running the company, and the chairman is a person who is really responsible for running the board, to make sure that board meetings are called frequently enough, to make sure the right things are decided, to make sure that everyone contributes to the board meeting, to make sure the proper minutes are kept. When the problems of kind of WorldCom and Enron were investigated, and other similar scandals, one of the commonest reasons that was identified for their problems was they had a dominant chief executive. Someone who was both chairman and the chief executive officer, someone who's to some extent a bully, that the other directors were actually frightened, really, to stand up against. So this dominant chief executive could do almost anything he or she wanted, take the company off into unsafe acquisitions, unsafe areas of business, and so on, get the company to sign up to very generous remuneration packages. So what we have here is a split at the top, the CEO and the chairman, and one kind of supervises the other through the split. The chairman is responsible, as I say, for the leadership of the board. There should also be non-executive directors here. So we have the board where you have your executive directors like the sales director, the finance director, the manufacturing director, IT director, and so on. They are hands-on people dealing with particular specialties. But then you have non-executive directors, people who are appointed to the board, full board members with full voting power, but who do not take place in the active day-to-day management. They sit on the board, they can observe, they can warn, they can advise, and they can vote. And the idea is these people are a kind of restraining force, and perhaps maybe an ethical force that the rest of the board has to kind of contend with. They should be people of sufficient standing, sufficient expertise, that they can constructively challenge what maybe the rest of the board is suggesting. The non-executive directors here should be what people talk about, a balance. So it's not like having your executive directors, 6 of those, and a kind of token 1 or 2 non-executive directors. It's about 50%. And your board should, all of them, non-executive directors as well, should have sufficient experience, independence, knowledge, and so on. For a company of that type, they should have the right kind of stature which is there. But this is important, that the non-executive directors got a proper balance, that they have a really powerful voice in the board. How do we get people appointed to the board? And again, the old ways were that maybe the chief executive officer down at the golf club, got an old mate at the golf club, says to this friend, would you like to be a director of the company? And there's no reason why that friend was going to be any good whatsoever at being director of the company. And of course the friend would then feel beholden to this person who kind of given them a job and might be reluctant to vote against your friend. Now, basically, directors and indeed non-executive directors should be appointed like anybody else. They should be draw up what do we need, what skills do we need to fulfill this function. We'll advertise for the post, we'll get the applications coming in, we'll shortlist those, we will interview the best candidates, and we'll give the job to the person we think is the best mix of skills and reputation and ability and so on, the best person for the job. This is going to be done by a nomination committee, and the nomination committee is going to be NEDs. So the appointment of your executive directors, taken away from the directors, it's handed over to the nomination committee, independent people who are your non-executive directors. All directors should give sufficient time. Nothing says how much sufficient time is here, whether it's a couple of meetings a month or whether it's 5 meetings a week or whatever it is, but there should be sufficient time to deal with the decisions. We should not simply assume that a board member can join and will immediately know enough about the company to make decisions. If you were a lower level employee joining the company, you're probably going to be sent on a kind of induction course or some training days to get you up to speed. Why should it be different for people at the top? They're making really important decisions, so it's really important that they are given some training, almost some induction on maybe what the current issues facing the company are and so on. They need to be given sufficient information, so they need to make sure that they get proper management reports and so on. They can actually make decisions based as far as you can on facts rather than supposition. They should be rigorously evaluated every year. And again, it seemed odd that nearly everybody within an organisation had an annual kind of staff review, and you'd be told where you did well, where you didn't do so well, how you could improve and so on. Is it not a bit peculiar that the people at the top, who are maybe the people who've got most influence on the success of the company, were not independently reviewed? So these directors have to undergo a kind of review process, really, and that will be held also by the non-executive directors. And directors should be removed from time to time, or they should resign from time to time and submit themselves to re-election, so you don't get people kind of with their feet under the table for the next 10 years. Accountability here. The board should present a balanced and understandable assessment of the company's position and prospects. Now, some of this, of course, will be in the financial statements, the statement of financial position, the profit and loss account, and so on here. But increasingly, the annual reports are growing and growing and growing. Increasingly now, they, as we mentioned in a previous lecture, there are risk reports. Where the board sets out, here's what we do, here's where the major risks are, here's how we're countering those, and so on. The idea of integrated reporting, where we're talking about maybe the strategic position, a long-term position of the company, is now becoming increasingly common. And it's important, here we have coming right into this paper, that the board is responsible for determining the significant risks facing the organisation and should maintain a sound risk management and internal control system. It's not necessarily the board itself which goes out and sees cables going across the floor and so on, but they have to make sure that they have delegated a risk manager or delegated to a risk committee the day-to-day running of this risk management system, but ultimately it comes home to rest with the board. Similarly, internal control systems, primarily dealing with looking after the financial internal control, it is the board which is inescapably responsible for making sure that the assets of the company are safeguarded, that the transactions of the company are properly recorded. The board should establish formal and transparent arrangements for applying the corporate reporting risk management internal control principles, and also for appropriate relationships with the company's auditors. Now, essentially, this is the audit committee. And the audit committee is going to be, again, non-executive directors here. So this is a second little subcommittee of non-executive directors. We had the nomination committee, how you find new directors. We now have the audit committee. And the audit committee is going to liaise with the external auditors. We'll see in a moment what that will entail. And also the internal auditors. It gives huge strength because now we have a committee of non-executive directors dealing with these auditing matters. But then these people also sit on the main board and they can bring up concerns at the main board level that the auditors might have. The audit committee liaises with the external auditors. For example, the scope. The scope is largely actually determined by law, but you could ask the external auditors maybe to do some additional work. It will act as a kind of halfway house between the directors and the auditors, because the auditors are often talking in very technical language about accounting standards and auditing standards and so on. And maybe the external auditors act as a kind of a filter or almost translation service there. What happens if the external auditors think the financial statements do not show a true and fair view? Then they explain their concerns to the audit committee. The audit committee can then go to the main board and say, well, we think the financial statements should be perhaps changed. And the external auditors in law have the right to see all documents and the right to hear all explanations. But what happens if they feel they're being obstructed in getting hold of the information they need to perform their audit? They can complain to the audit committee, who can then bring it up at the main board. Before there were audit committees, auditors primarily dealt with the finance director. But do you see there's a kind of a bit of a problem, a bit of a conflict of interest there. The finance director is, say, typically in charge or responsible for the system of internal control. But then the auditor has a complaint about the system of internal control. And you can see how the finance director would be embarrassed by that. And although the auditors complain about the internal control, the finance director chooses not to raise that at the board meeting because it looks embarrassing. Or the auditors discover a fraud, and that's very embarrassing for the finance director. So what are they going to do? Again, maybe the finance director kind of conceals it or downplays it. But if the auditors bring this up with the audit committee, a group of NEDs who can then decide whether it's worthwhile, of significance, to bring up at the main board meeting. The audit committee should also really be reviewing internal audit and reviewing the internal control. Internal auditors do not have to be appointed under corporate governance, but there is a requirement that need for internal audit is kept under review. I don't know if it said that in the previous. Yes, it did. The audit committee must be there under corporate governance, but must examine then the internal control. Yes, we must consider the need for internal audit. You're not absolutely bound to an internal audit department, but it's becoming more and more common. And again, if there hadn't been an audit committee, your internal auditors probably appointed maybe by the finance director, and then they're complaining about maybe bad internal control. You're kind of complaining to your boss, you're kind of complaining to the person who is appointed you, responsible for your promotion and so on. Allowing internal audit to primarily report to the audit committee gives huge strength to the standing, really, and maybe the reputation of the internal audit. The audit committee might also ask for special investigations to be done, typically maybe if they're worried about a fraud or maybe worried about bribery occurring within the company. If those risks are there, then the audit committee might ask either the external auditors or indeed the internal auditors to undertake special investigations. Remuneration, pay. And this was the subject of great kind of misbehaviour, really, of many directors, where maybe they awarded themselves pay which was far too high, or bonuses that were far too easy to obtain. It's still quite controversial. There have recently been a number of occasions where the members voted against the pay that was recommended by the Remuneration Committee, although at the moment in the UK, what the Remuneration Committee recommends, the board, the members of the company can't really overturn. Their vote is kind of advisory. We think they're being paid too much, but they can't actually stop it. So it's maybe slightly unsatisfactory. But not after the cheapest possible directors. we want a level of remuneration sufficient to attract and retain and motivate directors of sufficient quality. Anyone could find a cheap director, but the cheap director with poor experience is not going to be good for your shareholders. But you don't want to pay more than is necessary. Next one's quite interesting. A significant proportion of the executive director's remuneration should be linked towards corporate and individual performance. In other words, some sort of performance-related pay. So in other words, what's good for the company is good for the directors, and that should be good for the shareholders. A very common way of arranging this is to have share options. Here again, we're interested in the long-term performance of the company. So if you say, let's say the current share price is, let's say, $9, what you do is you offer some share options that they can buy in maybe at, let's say, $14 in maybe 5 years. So 5 years is what's called a vesting period. You don't really get your hands on the shares, if you want to, until 5 years is up. So the current share price is 9. If after 5 years the current share price is only 12, then the share options aren't really worth anything. You wouldn't insist on a right in buying at 14 if the share price then was 12. But if after 5 years your actual share price has kind of gone up to 16, then of course the share options become very valuable to the directors. The directors can still buy at 14. That's what the option does for them, an option to buy at 14. We could buy and immediately sell at 16. There's great incentive there for the directors to make the share price, or to try to grow the share price over the 5 years to be at least 14. And of course, if the share price is growing, you're increasing the wealth of the shareholders. So what is good for the shareholders is good for the directors, and everybody's kind of got this goal congruence going on. Note that it is executive directors' remuneration. It is not non-executive directors. Non-executive directors should not be profit related. You want these people to give independent advice, which has not been in some way distorted by the hope of making a lot more income if the company makes a lot more profit, because this might induce the non-executive directors to take risky decisions. So they get a flat fee. So they are quite divorced in a way from taking the gamble, taking the risk, if you like, on sending the company down a very, very kind of chancy investment. And there should be a remuneration committee. A formal, transparent procedure for developing the executive's remuneration. The remuneration committee is again going to be non-executive directors. They would not decide the non-executive director's remuneration. Non-executive director's remuneration is typically decided by an AGM of some sort here. But the remuneration of the directors, the executive directors, should be decided upon by the committee of non-executive directors, the remuneration committee. As I said recently, in time for this recording, companies like BP, companies like WBP, there have been some kind of revolts by shareholders at the generosity that the remuneration committees seemed willing to give to the executive directors. Although they voted against what was recommended, the law doesn't let them actually vote it down. And finally, relations with shareholders. There should be a dialogue with shareholders based on the mutual understanding of objectives. So let shareholders know what you're doing, why you're doing it. Let shareholders know what your attitude to risk is. You may have to work hard to communicate constantly with shareholders and so on, but surely things have become much easier with the internet and emails. Instead of having stuff printed at great expense of posting it out to maybe hundreds of thousands of shareholders, there's no reason why regular bulletins can't be sent out to shareholders. Encourage them to come to the AGM. maybe you encourage him by offering him a nice lunch or something of that sort there. As I say, to some extent, it's, shareholders can be their own worst enemy. They are very passive. But the Corporate Governance Code wants to turn passive shareholders into active shareholders who will look after their own interests and will look after and take an interest in what the directors are doing.